Hi everybody, this is Subhashri Pandey, and today I'm here with Professor Ben Saul from Sydney University, who is a professor in the University of Sydney, who is also taking Professor of Law in the University of Sydney. He is here currently in Nepal with us in the program of Himalayan Field School. He is a professor who has facilitated us even in this program as well. So before me going forward with this session, would like to have Professor Ben Saul give his own introduction.
Hello, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me on the program. My name's Ben Saul. I'm the Chalice Chair of International Law at the University of Sydney. So I teach international law, I research and write books. I do consultancy for governments, NGOs. I do some legal casework. Some media work as well. So being an academic is a very diverse career and gives you lots of opportunity to pursue what you're interested in. I've also recently been appointed the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counter-Terrorism, which is a mandate from the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva and also from the UN General Assembly in New York.
So, talking about this specific program as well, Kathmandu School of Law and Sydney University has had a long history of collaboration. So, what is your take on that, and how do you think that it's going to foster in coming years?
We've been so lucky to have collaborated with Kathmandu School of Law since 2007. So, shortly after the Civil War and the peace agreement, we both jointly did an aid project funded by the Australian government, AusAid, to essentially develop a training, law enforcement training curriculum for the police and armed police, and also judges, prosecutors, defence attorneys, on human rights in the criminal justice system, which at that time was in a state of great reform and transition. And we travelled all over Nepal, doing trainings under that program for people from all of those organisations. That then led to our collaboration, which has been going on since then, what we call the Himalayan Field School, which is a program for Sydney Law School students, plus Kathmandu School of Law students, on law development and human rights. So it's trying to essentially understand through the example of Nepal the challenges of the development process.
So, what exactly brought the concept of Himalayan Field School? Because it is very different to the models of the programs that various universities around the world are following. So, what was the main?
That's right. And in Australia, legal education is pretty traditional, right? Mm-hmm. So it's lectures in a classroom, and we were inspired by Kathmandu School of Law, whose then the dean, Professor Yubraj Sangrula, had been for quite some time taking groups of Nepali students to travel into the countryside in Nepal, to go walking and camping and meeting people in villages and talking to them. So this model of what we call experiential learning, that is learning in the field through seeing things like the development process or human rights in action through NGOs or state institutions, was something we were really attracted to and thought would be great to expose Australian students to. And who better to do that with than Kathmandu School of Law, which had that experience. And so that was the origin of the collaboration, which has now been going on for, this is the 11th field school. So it's been a huge success, getting better and better every year.
So you have been in the field of academics in a long run, like for a long while. So I want to know about what kind of experiences have you had, because I'm very sure you have had taught students internationally as well, in different countries as well. So what is your experience in teaching these different students from different countries around the world?
I've been very lucky because international law is obviously a subject which is studied and learnt about in every country around the world. So it's been a great opportunity to visit many countries. I think I've been to over 90 countries and taught in many, from Oxford and Harvard in the north to in China, India, also here in Nepal, Cambodia, Italy. And so obviously different universities around the world and different cultural traditions bring their own perspectives on international law. I mean, on the one hand, international law is a universal legal system which is supposed to be the same everywhere. but the way that it is implemented and applied or interpreted can actually vary significantly from country to country. And you see that on all kinds of issues, differences over human rights, or when the use of military force in self-defense against terrorists is permitted. And countries can take quite different views on that. And because people grow up with different perspectives on geopolitics, which puts pressure on international law. I mean, lots of states want to do things sometimes which don't comply with international law. So to see how those pressures play out in different countries has been extremely interesting for me.
So with reference to the fact that you're a UN rapporteur as well, so in our country you got the chance to visit so many places with so many people as well as interacted with them. Do you see yourself writing a report or some such within the context of our country? And what kind of learning do you have after the Himalayan Field School? Because I think you have been here for how many times of this Himalayan Field School?
11
times.
schools.
So 11 field schools, and you have been here. That means so much of things to know about, so much new things learning every time. Could you share a light upon the overall time of Himalayan Field School you have been here?
Sure. So on the UN Special Rapporteur, this is not an official country visit to Nepal. So we do undertake every year country visits with the official permission of the government, and that's a chance to do a kind of deep study of how counterterrorism laws and practices in the legislation, policing, military, security agencies, to look at to what extent they are complying with their international obligations. So that's not the purpose of this visit. I would say though that although Nepal does not currently face any significant terrorist challenges, which is very fortunate for Nepal, of course it is still dealing with the challenges of the past. And under the peace agreement, processes of transitional justice were supposed to be fulfilled. It's many years on now, almost 15 years I think since the peace agreement, and still there hasn't been adequate accountability for atrocities during the civil war with the Maoists during that period in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Legislation is currently being examined in Nepal to reform the traditional justice process yet again. And I think that the difficulty is the longer you wait after a conflict, the harder it becomes to mount successful prosecutions, because witnesses and victims may pass away, evidence becomes stale, memories fade, and I think that does a real disservice to the victims and their families who suffered some terrible violence during the Civil War, including violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and I think the promise of the peace process was that human rights violations would be remedied and victims would get satisfaction for what had happened during the war. So certainly more work needs to be done by the Nepali authorities on that front.
So I interacted with a lot of people from Himalayan Field School, and the prominent question everybody asks me if there are going to be any further programs where the alumni of Himalayan Field School are all going to gather up and then have a fruitful discussion that could be there. So is there any proposals or is there any new ideas apart from Himalayan Field School or the continuity of Himalayan Field School in a new manner?
So nothing concrete yet, but Professor Sangrula has suggested, for example, that we should have some kind of future collaboration, whether that takes the form of some kind of publication written by alumni of the program or some kind of conference, reunion, bringing together people from different year groups, Australian and Nepali. I think that's a great idea. I mean, it's been 11 years and every year we've learned new things and improved the program. And it has been such a successful program over so many years. That whatever we can do to solidify that collaboration would be terrific.
You have come to this Himalayan Field School so much times. What do you think would be your best moment, or any learning that you got that just is there forever in your heart?
Look, there are so many special moments, and from interacting with Nepali government authorities to the incredible NGOs here, like Shakti Samua, working with victims of sexual violence and trafficking, Lumanti, dealing with the problem of homelessness and informal settlement. I think for the students, the experience in Malamchi is very special because that's really the first time in their lives they've had the opportunity to sit down in the dirt with some very poor and disadvantaged families living along the river or in the hills, and just to talk very frankly about their lives and the challenges that they face. And most of our students in Australia, we're incredibly privileged. They're students, but they're still, by world standards, incredibly well off. They've had every opportunity in terms of family background, personal circumstances, quality of education, and so for a lot of them, it's quite a shock to see that there are actually many people in the world, here in Nepal and elsewhere, living in such difficult circumstances. And so that's the point of the program, I think, to kind of inspire students to use that knowledge that they've gained to do something with that in their own careers, whether they work in development or human rights or in the private sector, to hopefully one day reflect on that experience and somehow work to give back.
I have a question about human rights field as well, because since you have a very strong background in human rights, so in the world there are a lot of global superpower countries who just take away the limelight, and even the media is always focusing on these global superpowers of the world, like for example the Israel-Palestine war, Russia-Ukraine war, they are just there in highlight. What about special take on the things that goes on in other countries around the world, just like the coup in Niger or the dispute between Ethiopia and Somalia? So do you think is media or is the global superpower countries taking over the attention, and how various international organizations are not able to look at the other countries around the world?
What you suggest is absolutely true. I think the political and economic and military dominance of particularly certain countries, but also increasingly China and India and some others in their own spheres, absolutely shapes the international media coverage of international affairs. And so, yes, we've been hearing a lot in recent years about the Ukraine-Russia war and then the Israel-Gaza war, while, as you suggest, at the same time there are some horrific situations in other countries which barely register in the Western media. To give one example at the moment, this terrible civil war in Sudan, which is ripping the country apart, leaving huge numbers of people displaced and at risk of famine and violence, and yet there's barely any attention to it. Meanwhile, the mobilization of humanitarian aid resources, protection of refugees for Ukraine has diverted available funds to many of those other situations. And so it's hard to avoid the perception that it's not just about geopolitics, it could also be about race, right? Ukrainians are worthy of protection, but not Sudanese or Yemenis or Ethiopians, all of these other terrible situations. The international system is a victim of that. So the United Nations, every state gets a vote and a place in the General Assembly. So those issues, different perspectives can be brought out, and the Global South has a majority in the General Assembly. The problem is the General Assembly has no binding legal powers to do anything, right? So it can certainly shape global opinion and change perspectives, but it's only the Security Council that has legal power to compel all countries to do things to enforce international security. The problems there, of course, are that the Council is totally unrepresentative of world power today. It reflects who won the Second World War over 70 years ago, so it's certainly not fit for purpose in terms of being representative. And also those other powers, 5 of them, the permanent 5 members, have a veto power. So they can just stop, clearly a majority of the world want to stop Israeli violations in Gaza, for example, but they can't because the United States would exercise and has exercised its veto to prevent any kind of sanction against Israel. So look, the UN has to do the best with what it's got, and it's certainly lots of people within the UN system try to push back against those power realities. But the international system is certainly not fair or well equipped to deal in a fair way with all of the many disputes we face.
Yeah. Could we get your insight or insider information about what kind of role you personally take on as a UN reporter, and then how these different kind of issues around the world are brought out to the light?
So UN special rapporteurs are appointed by the United Nations as independent experts. So the advantage of that is that we're not United Nations bureaucrats or civil servants, so we don't have to play by those internal rules. We're also not elected by states through campaigning by states, so we're supposed to be appointed on merit rather than by horse trading of votes, which happens in lots of other bodies, including some of the human rights bodies, I have to say, where you don't necessarily get the best candidates, you get the politically acceptable candidates. So what we do is, within our different areas, we write a couple of thematic reports each year, one to the General Assembly and one to the Human Rights Council, about emerging contemporary, cutting-edge issues in our area and how human rights applies to those issues. We conduct official country visits to inspect how countries are complying with their human rights obligations. Each week we deal with what we call communications, which are individual complaints brought by people in any country about, in my case, about how, for example, counter-terrorism laws are being weaponized or misused against civil society to suppress journalists or political dissidents or indigenous activists. And we bring those complaints to the governments concerned at a high diplomatic level and try to bring pressure onto them that the international community is watching and expects those countries to do better and not to torture people or disappear them or summarily execute them because they've been accused of terrorism. We also work through the media, so we issue press statements and try to, if our dialogue with states at the diplomatic level is not bearing fruit, then we can go public to try to bring pressure from the outside as well. So special rapporteurs, there are different types. There are what we call thematic rapporteurs, like mine, which is on a particular area, like summary executions or torture or counter-terrorism in my case. And then there are country-based rapporteurs. There are fairly few of them, about 14 I think at the moment. So like a country like Myanmar will be subject to additional scrutiny and those rapporteurs just focus on human rights in that country.
Provided the fact that you are also an academician, you are also a rapporteur, how do you manage this? Because you seem to have been doing a lot, and then how do you handle all of this all at once?
It's a challenge, and I've got my full-time job as an academic, and the UN roles are unpaid because there is no money in human rights in the UN system, whereas in contrast there's a lot of money in counter-terrorism in the UN system. So a number of countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been giving many hundreds of millions of dollars to the UN because they want to suppress terrorism. But the challenge is they don't necessarily do that in a way which complies with human rights. I have a couple of staff in Geneva, so human rights officers at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So they help me a lot on a day-to-day basis, and I've fundraised for some external legal advisors as well in London and the US. So and I get some pro bono support from university, law school clinics, lawyers acting pro bono if, for example, we lodge an amicus or an intervention in strategic litigation in courts around the world. So we cobble together the support we can get, but it is difficult because the scale of the human rights challenges are vast and our resources are pretty limited.
Okay, so in matters of let's jump back to Himalayan Field School again. So in matters of Himalayan Field School, are there any are there any new agendas or any new diverse topics that you want to cover next time that might have been left this time?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we take feedback every year from our students and from Kathmandu School of Law to think about what we could do differently next time. Over the years, we have changed issues. So for example, in the past, we looked at the situation of Bhutanese refugees in Nepal when there were many still here, or the ongoing problem of Tibetan refugees here. Some students would like a greater focus, for example, on gender issues to do more on that side. So I think we can continue to be creative about what we study. Biodiversity, climate change, environment. There's more scope to do that. We could also change some of our field visits as well, right? So in the past, we've done some World Bank projects. This time we did an Asian Development Bank project. We've talked previously about a visit to Chitwan National Park to look at environmental protection. So look, Nepal's such a great case study because the full spectrum of human rights and development issues are really present here. It's a great way to teach students in a real-world context about what those problems look like. Shri, if you have any suggestions, you've been with us for 2 weeks, so you've seen what we cover, and absolutely, we'd love to hear from you and the other Nepalis about things you're interested in and things you think we should be interested in.
Yeah, we just would wish you guys stayed here for longer because it was an absolute lovely time with you people, and how we could share our cultures, how we could learn so much from the perspective of the Australian government or Australian citizens as well. So that was a very wonderful learning experience even for us because we got to learn so much more within so much less time, and I'm very thankful for that as well. So thank you so much for providing your insights. Are there any message that you want to give to the people who are watching and then who are willing to join the field of human rights especially?
Well, firstly, let me thank you and the Nepali students and teachers who accompanied us over the last 2 weeks. Our students absolutely love your participation and all the hard work you did for us in interpreting many interviews in difficult contexts sometimes, and being so warm and generous and friendly to our Australian students. It just made their stay such a delight. Also to get just that insight into Nepali culture and your lives and your experience of development and human rights in a developing country as the emerging leaders of this country as you move through law school. I'd encourage your listeners absolutely to pursue an interest in human rights. Even if it's not a professional interest that you practice in, human rights are important for all of us. Not just in our interactions with governments or private corporations, but in our personal lives as well, and in ensuring that in all of our relationships we respect each other, even when people are very different and have different political views to ours, to not give in to that kind of dynamic of polarization and division, which has affected many Western countries, I'd certainly say, from the US to Europe. So human rights is such an important basis for communities to just get along with each other, and so if your listeners have never done any human rights, never heard about much about it, there are lots of great resources out there, including on the website of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which has lots of guides and manuals and fact sheets for just ordinary people. Don't need a legal education to learn more about what they are and how you can use them as tools to protect yourself and your own communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Professor, for your very informative as well as insightful information that you gave, because not only how we were able to learn about how United Nations or how human rights concept around the world is, but then we also got to learn different kind of things that was associated with legal aspects as well. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart, from the entire KSL family, as well as the other participants that were there. We are looking forward to meeting you more in the other programs to come, so do come by. Yes, so thank you so much. With this, we can end our podcast for today.
Thanks so much, Shri, and it was my pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your very insightful and interesting questions. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much.